Hello, and welcome back to Last Week Tonight. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into the murky waters of international trade, because apparently, it's 2018 again. And no, this isn't some cruel April Fool's joke 4 months late. President Trump, in a move that can only be described as shockingly predictable, has decided to slap tariffs on goods from Canada, Mexico, and China. That's right, folks, the tariff man is back, and he's brought his tariff gun. Now you might be thinking, but John, didn't we already go through this? Weren't we promised trade peace? Didn't we learn our lesson? And to that I say, you give the American people far too much credit. Plus, have you met our president? The man loves a good trade war more than a well-done steak, and that's saying something. But let's take a step back and really understand what tariffs are and why they matter. Tariffs are essentially taxes imposed on imported goods. The idea is to make foreign products more expensive, thereby encouraging consumers to buy domestic products instead. Sounds simple, right? Well, not quite. The reality is far more complex and often counterproductive. For one, tariffs can lead to higher prices for consumers. When the cost of imported goods goes up, companies often pass that cost on to you, the consumer. So, while the intention might be to protect domestic industries, the immediate effect is that you end up paying more for everyday items. And it's not just about higher prices. Tariffs can also lead to trade wars, where countries retaliate by imposing their own tariffs on American goods. This tit-for-tat escalation can hurt businesses and workers on both sides. For example, American farmers have been hit hard by retaliatory tariffs from China, leading to a surplus of unsold crops and financial strain. It's a lose-lose situation that can spiral out of control. So why are we back here in 2018, reliving this nightmare? The answer lies in a mix of political posturing and economic nationalism. President Trump has long championed the idea of America first, and tariffs are a tangible way to show he's taking action. But the reality is that these measures often do more harm than good. And no, this isn't some cruel April Fool's joke 4 months late. It's a calculated move that plays well with a certain segment of the electorate, even if it defies economic logic. President Trump, in a move that can only be described as shockingly predictable, has decided to slap tariffs on goods from Canada, Mexico, and China. That's right, folks, the tariff man is back, and he's brought his tariff gun. Now you might be thinking, but John, didn't we already go through this? Weren't we promised trade peace? Didn't we learn our lesson? And to that I say, you give the American people far too much credit. Plus, have you met our president? The man loves a good trade war more than a well-done steak, and that's saying something. That's right, folks, the tariff man is back, and he's brought his tariff gun. Now you might be thinking, but John, didn't we already go through this? Weren't we promised trade peace? Didn't we learn our lesson? And to that I say, you give the American people far too much credit. Plus, have you met our president? The man loves a good trade war more than a well-done steak, and that's saying something. Now you might be thinking, but John, didn't we already go through this? Weren't we promised trade peace? Didn't we learn our lesson? And to that I say, you give the American people far too much credit. Plus, have you met our president? The man loves a good trade war more than a well-done steak, and that's saying something. Weren't we promised trade peace? Didn't we learn our lesson? And to that I say, you give the American people far too much credit. Plus, have you met our president? The man loves a good trade war more than a well-done steak, and that's saying something. Didn't we learn our lesson? And to that I say, you give the American people far too much credit. Plus, have you met our president? The man loves a good trade war more than a well-done steak, and that's saying something. And to that, I say, you give the American people far too much credit. Plus, have you met our president? The man loves a good trade war more than a well-done steak, and that's saying something. Plus, have you met our president? The man loves a good trade war more than a well-done steak, and that's saying something. The man loves a good trade war more than a well-done steak, and that's saying something. So, what exactly are these tariffs, and who do they hurt? Tariffs are essentially taxes imposed on imported goods. They are meant to make foreign products more expensive, thereby encouraging consumers to buy domestic products instead. But the reality is a bit more complicated. Tariffs can lead to higher prices for consumers and constrain relationships between countries. They can also impact businesses that rely on imported materials to produce their goods. Well, let's break it down, shall we? When a country imposes tariffs, it can create a ripple effect throughout the economy. For instance, if the cost of raw materials goes up due to tariffs, manufacturers might pass those costs onto consumers in the form of higher prices. This can lead to inflation, which affects everyone's purchasing power. On March 4, 2025, Trump imposed a hefty 25% tariff on goods from both Canada and Mexico. This move was part of his broader strategy to protect American industries and jobs. However, it also sparked concerns about potential retaliation from these neighboring countries. Because nothing says I love my neighbors like a good old-fashioned trade barrier. These tariffs can create tension and lead to trade wars, where countries keep imposing tariffs on each other's goods, making it more difficult and expensive to trade. As for China, well, they got hit with a 10% increase on existing tariffs. This was part of an ongoing trade dispute aimed at addressing issues like intellectual property theft and trade imbalances. But these tariffs also mean higher costs for American companies that import Chinese goods, which can lead to higher prices for consumers. Now, I know what you're thinking. John, percentages are confusing, and you're right, they can be. But let's try to simplify it. A 25% tariff means that if a product originally cost $100, it will now cost $125. A 10% tariff means that a product costing $100 will now cost $110. Just tell me what this means in terms of actual things. Well, these tariffs can affect a wide range of products that we use every day. From the food we eat to the electronics we use, tariffs can make these items more expensive. This can be especially challenging for families on a tight budget. Well, my friends, buckle up because it's about to get real. The impact of these tariffs can be felt across various sectors of the economy. For example, higher tariffs on Canadian lumber can increase the cost of building homes, while tariffs on Mexican avocados can make your favorite guacamole more expensive. We're talking about tariffs on everything from Canadian lumber and Mexican avocados to Chinese electronics and machinery. These tariffs can disrupt supply chains, increase costs for businesses, and ultimately lead to higher prices for consumers. So, while tariffs are intended to protect domestic industries, they can also have unintended consequences that affect us all. Now, if there's one thing we've learned about China, it's that they don't take kindly to being pushed around. So naturally they retaliated, and they retaliated hard. China slapped additional tariffs ranging from 10% to 15% on a whole bunch of American goods. We're talking chicken, wheat, soybeans, beef, the whole agricultural shebang. Remember, this is on top of the tariffs they already had in place from the 2018 trade war. It's like they're playing tariff Tetris and America keeps sending over the long, skinny blocks. Canada, on the other hand, took a slightly more measured approach. Initially, they hit back with retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of US goods. But here's the kicker. They also have another $125 billion worth of tariffs waiting in the wings, ready to be unleashed in 21 days if the US doesn't back down. And if you think that's all, think again. Canada is also considering some non-tariff measures, which is a polite way of saying we're going to make your life difficult in ways you haven't even thought of yet. So, what happens when the world's largest economies decide to engage in a game of tariff chicken? It's a high-stakes game where no one really wins, but everyone feels the pain. The global economy is a delicate ecosystem, and when major players like the US and China start imposing tariffs on each other, the ripple effects are felt worldwide. Well, the stock market throws a tantrum, obviously. Investors hate uncertainty, and nothing screams uncertainty like a trade war. The mere mention of tariffs can send traders into a frenzy, selling off stocks in a panic. On March 3, 2025, the mere whiff of a trade war sent US stock indexes plummeting faster than a lead balloon in a wind tunnel. It was a day that traders and investors won't soon forget. The markets opened with a sense of foreboding, and by midday it was clear that this was no ordinary trading session. The S&P 500 suffered its biggest loss since December, wiping out billions of dollars in market value in just a few hours. Financial analysts were left scrambling to make sense of the chaos, but the numbers spoke for themselves. The Dow Jones Industrial Average took a nosedive, shedding points at an alarming rate. Traders on the floor were seen with their heads in their hands, a universal sign of despair in the financial world. And the Nasdaq? Well, let's just say it wasn't pretty. Tech stocks, which had been riding high, were suddenly in freefall. The ticker turned a sea of red, and investors were left wondering how long the downturn would last. And it wasn't just the US markets feeling the heat. The interconnected nature of the global economy means that when one market sneezes, others catch a cold. Traders from Tokyo to London were glued to their screens, watching the carnage unfold. Asian and European markets were also left reeling, with indexes across the board taking a hit. In Asia, markets in Japan, China, and South Korea saw significant declines, while in Europe, major indexes in Germany, France, and the UK were not spared either. With indexes across the board either dipping or at best remaining stagnant, the financial world was left in a state of shock. News anchors reported on the stagnation with a sense of gravity, knowing that the implications of this market mayhem would be felt for weeks, if not months, to come. The question on everyone's mind was simple: how long would this turmoil last, and what would it take to restore stability? Section 6. A Brief Reprieve. Now, you might be wondering, how did we get here? Weren't things supposed to be okay with Canada and Mexico? Well, you see, about a month before this whole tariff fiasco, Trump had actually granted Canada and Mexico a reprieve from previous tariffs. The catch? They had to agree to help him with his two favorite things: border security and cracking down on drug trafficking. Because apparently, international trade negotiations are best conducted like an episode of Narcos. Section 7. The art of the deal, or not. So, there you have it, folks. The US, Canada, and China, locked in a trade war that nobody asked for and nobody wants. It's enough to make you wonder if anyone involved has ever actually read The Art of the Deal, or if they just flipped through it once while waiting for their spray tan to dry. Because let's be honest, this isn't deal-making, it's economic brinkmanship. And while it might make for a good headline, it's the global economy, and by extension all of us, who end up paying the price. Section 8. The global impact. The ripple effects of this trade war are already being felt worldwide. Businesses are struggling to adapt to the ever-changing tariff landscape, consumers are facing higher prices, and the uncertainty is stifling investment and economic growth. It's a lose-lose situation for everyone involved, except maybe the people who sell those giant inflatable rats that unions use for protests. They're probably doing a roaring trade right now. Section 9. The future of trade. So, what does the future hold for global trade? Honestly, at this point, your guess is as good as mine. But if there's one thing we can learn from history, it's that trade wars are never easy, they're never quick, and they're never good for anyone involved. So, buckle up, folks, because it looks like we're in for a bumpy ride. And in the immortal words of every economist ever, please, for the love of all that is holy, stop messing with the tariffs.